Empires have a way of becoming banks when they disappear from the map. Yet perhaps the greatest continuation of any empire in all history is the way that Rome was able to survive within the Catholic Church. As the most dominant church in the world, Catholicism is influential, widespread, and the church is big business. Early on, the church was financed by many different methods. It would make money through tithing and donations, through taxes and fees collected in the church's direct territory of the Papal States. Through the great many properties the church owned, it would collect rents. And during the most dire chapter in all of church history, it would make money through the sale of indulgences. Yet when it came to more sophisticated finance, for a long time the church relied on its relationships with merchant bankers, the powerful merchant families of the Renaissance and early modern world. Families like the Medici, Frescobaldi, and Fuggers. The church would run its financial transactions through figures like these, very often taking on large loans. Yet sometimes the Pope would directly issue debt, shares in debt securities, much like bonds today. And for its own part, the church would be a financier itself. Yet with the strong opposition to usury, there was a great degree of discomfort around charging interest. The church would collect fees on currency transactions, or issue no-interest loans, yet affixing a fee for late payment. For centuries, methods like these allowed the church to become extraordinarily wealthy, on top of the vast social and political power that it already had, particularly in the centuries of united Christendom. Yet as the modern period rolled on and finance became increasingly sophisticated, with vast European empires sprawling around the globe, the Vatican found that it needed to adapt. It needed to be more sophisticated, and beginning in the late 19th century, the Vatican would begin building a financial empire to rival great banks and nations. The Vatican Bank is a financial entity that doesn't come up too often, yet it is a truly remarkable power player in the world of finance and business. The unification of religious, political, and financial power is something truly astonishing to behold. And while people may not regularly think of the Vatican as a financial power player, to understand the world of big money, it's certainly a player that must be understood. So let's take a look at the Vatican Bank, the vast network of real estate and banking interactions, the financial might that rests in Rome. And we'll find that beyond mere wealth, and beyond even the power of finance and banking, there is truly extraordinary political power in the Vatican. For the Catholic Church is one of the most foundational entities of all the West. So let's take a deeper look. This is the story of God's gold and the bishop bankers. As the High Medieval Age began, and the political and economic structures of Europe became more complex, so too would the financing needs of the Church. Many of the first forms of what we consider to be modern finance that were used by the Church came from the powerful merchant banking families of Italy, particularly emerging in the 13th century. Families arose as facilitators of the thriving businesses in the area, some of them realizing that far better than having princes and kings as your clients, quite renowned for defaulting on their loans, the church was the ideal customer. Families like the Bardi and Peruzzi families would emerge. During the 14th century, they had extraordinary dominance over Europe, building a vast international network of financial institutions, beginning in Italy and stretching all the way to England. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Frescobaldi family would become extraordinarily wealthy as they were given the right and responsibility to manage papal tax collection. Around this time as well, the Bonsignori family would become early pioneers of branch banking, building a great fortune facilitating papal finance internationally across the network. Merchant banking families like these were able to make money through a variety of methods. The most direct one, and particularly during the medieval period the best job you could get, was by being tax collector for the papacy, earning a commission on the enormous revenues flooding to the church. They would as well make money by facilitating international money transfers, collecting fees on international transactions, often involving multiple currencies. This would sometimes be done utilizing bills of exchange, which are much like cross-currency futures, an agreement to transact in a given currency at a given time in the future. This gave these bankers the opportunity to make money via currency arbitrage, profiting on small deviations between what a price is and ought to be. Many of the techniques they employed were functionally charging interest. However, at the time, there was a ban on the charging of interest, so they had to smuggle it in, quite often charging fees that ultimately were interest but were not named as such. For example, issuing a no-interest loan. Yet, if you paid it back late, which really was the time you were going to pay it back, you simply paid a lateness fee. As these bankers began to get more and more church customers, they would make money on deposits, which the priests and bishops would pay them interest on, though it wasn't truly interest. They were simply being paid a gift by the church. Over time, some of the merchant bankers who established the best relationships with the church would obtain vast fortunes by being granted monopolies by the papacy, as well as powerful bishops. Yet one family that particularly stands out, not only as prominent merchant bankers, but as politicians and popes, truly combining financial, political, and church power, is the Medici family. The story of this family really begins to get interesting with Giovanni de' Medici, a merchant who founded Medici Bank in 1397. The bank would do extraordinarily well. Prior to this point, older Florentine banks operated as centralized partnerships. The bank was what it was, where it was. Yet Giovanni would extend his banking business around Europe, building branches in the most important cities across the continent, including Rome, Venice, Geneva, and London. Each bank would be given a certain degree of autonomy, with each functioning as its own partnership, while Medici Bank as a whole maintained limited liability. So a catastrophic failure in one branch wouldn't take down the overall enterprise. Because of how dispersed these branches were, they were able to generate enormous revenues through international transactions, particularly through currency arbitrage and bills of exchange. Medici Bank would capture great interest from the church, as it proved to be an excellent method for bishops scattered across the continent to send their funds to Rome, with Medici taking a little cut each time. Their remarkable ability was further compounded by their use of double-entry bookkeeping, which allowed them to facilitate complex international transactions on an order that was extremely difficult at the time, truly standing out amongst their competitors. Yet one truly pivotal move that would set up the family for centuries to come was during the Schism, when multiple figures proclaimed themselves to be the rightful pope. Giovanni would back anti-pope John the 23rd, who needed to borrow an enormous amount to finance his military campaigns in order to assert his position as pope. To reward Giovanni as his banker, upon his success, he would make Medici the official bankers to the papacy in Rome. Yet, unfortunately, he would be deposed in 1415. Yet Giovanni would secure his release, and continue to maintain relationships with the papacy going forward, ultimately securing the position of depositor of the Apostolic Chamber, acting as the papacy's treasury, granting Medici the right to collect, transfer, and manage all church revenues. For subsequent generations, Medici would grow and expand their political and religious influence. Cosimo de' Medici would be born in 1389. He would continue the Medici banking business and consolidate vast power, beginning early on in his life working with his father and extended family in the banking business. As he would grow older and accumulate more and more wealth, he would realize that wealth can be translated into power, using his fortune to dominate Florentine politics. He would control the votes of major Florentine offices, as well as the councils, ultimately establishing such power for himself that he was functionally a sovereign, though unofficial. This level of power and influence began to draw suspicion. Other prominent families in Florence would begin seeking to reduce the power of the Medici, including the Albizzi family, who would form an anti-Medici political coalition. Yet, nonetheless, over the following years the family would continue to grow their dominance. Born in 1475, Giovanni de' Medici would enter the church very early in his life, becoming Cardinal of Santa Maria in Domenica at only the age of 13. Through his familial relations to Pope Innocent VIII, he was being fast-tracked in the church. In 1492, he would be admitted to the College of Cardinals and moved to Rome, where he would take up residence. During this period, another schism would emerge, and he would be given the position of papal legate in Bologna and Romagna, ultimately being set to fight for the Pope. Yet even though suffering some defeats, he would be elected Pope in 1513, taking the name of Pope Leo X. Pope Clement VII, born in 1478, was as well a Medici. During this period, the Medici were functionally sovereigns and popes. They dominated finance across Europe. And so, should we really say that the church was working with powerful merchant bankers? Or should we say that beginning at this point, the church was merchant bankers? Born in 1519, Cosimo I de' Medici would become Duke of Florence, nearly unifying all of Tuscany, and becoming elected Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569. Catherine de' Medici, born in 1519, would marry King Henry II of France. Following the death of her husband, she would act as a regent for her sons, functionally being the Queen of France during the French Wars of Religion. Thus, Medici power did not exist only in Italy. It existed across the church, and in powerful kingdoms all across the continent. Perhaps we can say that the church was taken over by bankers. Or, another way of looking at it, is that the church unified religious, political, and financial power. Yet, nonetheless, the Medici line would ultimately end. Giovanni Battista Gaston de' Medici, born in 1671, would be Grand Duke of Tuscany, and the last of the male Medici line. And as the church, and all Europe, would enter into the modern period, Medici power would dissipate. New banking empires would rise with the vast territorial and colonial empires of Europe. Finance would become more sophisticated, and new popes would sit in Rome. Yet what had been established all those centuries ago would continue. The church and international finance were heavily intertwined. As the early modern period began, finance began to become quite sophisticated, as trade networks expanded all across the globe, with enormous companies like the Dutch and British East India Companies holding vast swaths of territory. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, the banking system needed to adapt in order to facilitate it. Credit markets would become larger and more sophisticated. Much of the European empires would be based on banking, with many of the aspects of the territorial empires we think of today being later developments, while their earlier counterparts were more like trade networks, with outposts located across different continents. Truly powerful banking families would arise, beginning to supplant the traditional nobility. Families like the German Berenbergs, the British Barings and Rothschilds, as well as the more subtle Swiss bankers. These families began to assert dominance across the empires, as at their heart, these empires were commercial and financial. Over time, the financial systems of Europe began to coalesce around central banking models, where a central bank would have a monopoly on the creation of currency, and finance their governments by monetizing their debt, with an unending cycle of money creation and taxation. The powerful merchant banking families who made it to the top of that system had functionally made it to the top of the empires. They were the empires. Stretching across the globe, vast infrastructure projects would be built, and international merchant conglomerates would emerge, all fueled by the expanding debt markets, and an increasingly emergent market for stocks and derivatives. Throughout all of this, the church remained marvelously wealthy, and through heavy integration with prominent merchant families, was able to retain a quite strong position in the financial systems of these empires. Yet it didn't truly have an institution unto itself in this regard. That was until 1887. Pope Leo XIII would establish the Commission for Works of Charity. Originally, this wasn't a particularly sophisticated financial system, but it would form the basis of something much more grand. It was an investment management company, meant to organize and maintain oversight over church assets which would then be used for church goals, including charitable activity and the maintenance of the church. Over the following decades, as the unification of Italy had become a quite contentious matter, one of the glaring outstanding remaining questions was what exactly should be done with the church's lands. Over the course of the unification, the sovereign territory controlled by the church was eroded away, leaving quite a small amount of territory in Rome. In 1929, the Lateran Treaty would be signed, with a financial convention set up. Under the agreement of King Victor Emmanuel, it was agreed that the unified Kingdom of Italy would pay reparations to the church for the loss of its lands. As a result of this large influx, the church would set up a special body to maintain oversight and manage these funds, as well as administer them. The special administration of the Holy See would be established. By this point, the church had an enormous amount of wealth, but nothing that could truly be called a financial company, nor a bank. Yet they did now have investors and managers maintaining watchful eyes over their vast wealth. Wealth which now existed in many different forms: real estate, money, and financial assets. Under Pope Pius XI, Bernardino Nogara would be appointed to be the manager of the funds received from the treaty, functionally becoming the first investment manager of the church's wealth. With such vast fortune, and now an eye toward more modern financial management, in 1942, under Pope Pius XII, the Institute for the Works of Religion would be established. Its goal was quite straightforwardly to safeguard the church's assets. It was intended to preserve and grow the assets of the church. Yet more than that, it was given the ability to engage in financial transactions, earning it the name that would stick with it today: the Vatican Bank. Further financial institutions of the Vatican would be merged in 1967, as Pope Paul VI would consolidate and create the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See. Now, going into the mid-20th century, the church had its own bank, and a towering fortune. They owned real estate across the world, constant, enormous cash flows. They had investments in asset classes of all kinds, and were engaged in proper banking. Religion had become a bank, and now the bankers of the Vatican had a sophisticated structure and vast assets to play with. This would allow them to become a substantial power player in the world of international finance and politics, particularly as their influence extended to the quite unique realm of religion. So with all this influence, all this power, all this wealth, these assets, and your own vast financial institution, what would you do? The Vatican Bank hasn't operated just like any other bank. Throughout its history, it's been shrouded in conjecture, rumor, and scandal. This is partially owing to its vast wealth, but more than that, the status of the Vatican as the seat of one of the world's largest religions, and the unique diplomatic position of the Vatican has allowed it to operate in a way that no other bank can. Beginning in the 1930s, the Vatican would sign a concordat with Germany. It was seeking to secure church influence under the new German government, and would in turn facilitate flows within the nation. As the Second World War ramped up, it would receive tax payments from the Reich to evade Allied tracking and wartime restrictions. And while this is quite visible and evident, an element in all of this that is more difficult to clearly observe is just how deep its asset hiding for the German government went. Due to the relationship between the government of Germany and the Vatican, the Church's financial institutions and network would be the perfect place for the Germans to hide assets that Allied governments were looking for. This allowed the financiers of the Vatican to begin operating as an offshore haven, much in the way today that there are financial institutions in places like the Cayman Islands, Bahamas, Luxembourg, and Singapore. Right in the heart of Italy, sandwiched between the Axis powers, was a vast and very wealthy Vatican, which would serve as a perfect spot for the Germans to hide their wealth. This isn't to say that the Church cleanly took a side during the Second World War, but that they began to emerge as a wealth haven and as a mechanism for more secretive banking. Following the Second World War, this role as a haven and an opaque financial institution would lead to many a raised eyebrow when looking at their relationship with the Italian mafias, making this issue only messier. In 1978, Pope John Paul I would vow to clean up the Vatican Bank. Though his language would be more vague and diplomatic, he was talking about this laundering and its relationship with criminal entities. Yet quite curiously, he would die only 33 days into his papacy, shortly after announcing that he intended to clean the bank. There's a very long history of banks appearing to be suspiciously knowledgeable about the criminal organizations using them for laundering and hiding assets. This really began to emerge in the 1920s, particularly in the United States, as banks would allow bootleggers to evade the law, providing an entry point for their illicit funds to enter the legitimate economy. The Vatican, for its part, had many quite close entanglements with Italian organized crime, although not only the Italians. This would make the Vatican Bank the perfect place for Italian mafia funds to get laundered through. In the 1980s, a very public scandal would emerge. The Vatican Bank held a majority stake in Banco Ambrosiano, one of the most significant banks in Milan, as well as Italy's largest private bank. The bank would collapse, revealing a vast network of corruption, crime, fraud, and political machinations involving the mafia, Freemasons, and the Vatican Bank. Back in 1925, under the fascist government, new laws would be enacted banning Freemasonry, as well as more secret societies broadly. Prior to this, Freemasonry had held enormous political weight in Italy, to a notable degree, more than in many other countries. Masonic lodges were places where Italy's upper class and power players would meet, and with these new bans, they had to go underground. In 1945, after the end of Mussolini's government, the Masonic Lodge P2 would be reconstituted under the Grand Lodge of Italy. From there, it would begin to rebuild what it once was. In 1966, Licio Gelli would take over. He would seek a return to what Masonry once was in Italy. He yearned for the old days, where the power players met, discussed in secret, and maintained networks of vast, powerful entities. Thus, he would begin rebuilding such a network. He would use contacts with some of the most powerful men in Italy, and lure them in, often by claiming to have contacts with other powerful men in Italy, some which he did not have. But as he continued to do this over and over for years, eventually that network would manifest for real. By the 1980s, building a web of over 962 members, including some of the most powerful men in Italian government, business, finance, and organized crime. Around the same time, during the 1970s, Roberto Calvi would take over as general manager and chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, beginning a period of aggressive expansion. He would begin creating offshore entities, many of them used for money laundering. He would begin banking for the mafia, as well as transacting some very politically significant transactions, including facilitating Vatican-backed loans to the Polish Solidarity movement, as well as some quite substantial South American arms deals. By now, Lodge P2 was becoming very powerful, and it appears that they went as far as to begin involving themselves in bombing plots, including the 1970 Borghese attempt, attempting to move political will against the leftist factions and reassert his network in the government. The Lodge would as well begin a series of media takeovers. With this vast web of power players, they wanted control. Banco Ambrosiano would do banking services for P2, allowing the lodge to engage in secret financial transactions, particularly to their more criminal allies. Yet, by the end of the 1970s, Italy's central bank would investigate, and they would find irregularities in Banco Ambrosiano, including over $1 billion sent to Panamanian and Peruvian shell companies controlled by P2. By 1982, the situation had become quite dire. Calvi would flee charges, and would next appear hanged under Blackfriars Bridge in London. Initial investigations would rule that this was a suicide, although of course it wasn't, and later on it would be found that he had been murdered in a Mafia and P2 plot. That same year, regulators would seize the bank, after discovering 1.9 to 2.2 trillion lira in hidden debts, mostly to Vatican-backed entities. The Vatican would admit $250 million in exposure, but would deny wrongdoing, and after a series of failed rescue attempts, the government would declare the bank insolvent, with Treasury Minister Beniamino Andretta liquidating the bank. As this would proceed, Lodge P2's involvement in fraud would surface, with it becoming clear just how vast this network of businessmen, political power players, organized crime, and fraud was. And at every turn, the Vatican Bank was just on the outside of it. Creditors would sue the Vatican, settling for $244 million in 1984, and over the 1990s investigations would increase. Celli and 34 P2 members would be indicted for fraud, with Gelli receiving a 12-year sentence. The sheer enormity of P2's corruption web would be exposed, prompting bank reforms in Italy, as well as masonry bans. Ultimately, during trials from 2005 to 2010, Calvi's murder would be exposed as a Mafia and P2 plot. And as it became clear just how enormous and entrenched this web of corruption was, how many of the most powerful men in Italy were connected to organized crime, it would as well become evident that the Vatican was a pivotal part of the offshore web for asset hiding, money laundering, and fraud. From 2009 to 2013, money laundering probes would be conducted into the Vatican Bank, with President Ettore Gotti Tedeschi identified for 180 million euros in laundering, yet no charges stuck. JP Morgan would close a Vatican Bank account after further probes, identifying $1.8 billion in suspicious deposits. A 2013 report would show the Vatican as non-compliant on 16 anti-money laundering standards. Pope Benedict XVI would create a reform commission, and would even sack 4 cardinals. The heat was getting to the Vatican, as routinely for decades, they kept being found to either be involved in, or usually right on the periphery, of enormous criminal transactions. From 2014 to 2024, around 30 Vatican properties were sold in unauthorized transactions in London, generating 200 million euros funneled through the Vatican Bank. Ultimately, in 2024, former directors would be convicted of embezzlement. So, what do we do with all this? Because certainly many banks have been found to be non-compliant on anti-money laundering standards, or perhaps there's an odd account here or there. Fines happen all the time. Yet, what's troubling is that many banks do appear to be in on the operation. And with the Vatican Bank standing out as such a unique example, it's unfathomable to imagine that they aren't utilizing their unique position to take advantage of, acting as an agent for organized crime and the offshore network. There is an extraordinary amount of money in Rome, and an extraordinary amount of influence in the Church, particularly with Italy's history of a deeply entrenched deep state and organized crime. The Vatican is at the perfect place, at the heart of a very deeply corrupted web. And so, with all of this, it appears as though the Vatican is operating as a very large player in the offshore network, the web of hidden banks, the spider's web, a network connecting legitimate business, fraud, organized crime, intelligence agencies, and non-government actors. And with the unique diplomatic position, and the very old relationships and deep pockets of the Vatican, is it really that hard to imagine? Certainly there are going to be many Catholics who would look askance to this, unwilling to imagine that that much corruption could be going on in Rome. Yet banking is banking, and where there's an enormous amount of money to be made, there will always be somebody to make it.